Pillar 3. The philosophy. Law 19. You must sweat the small stuff. This law reveals what every great entrepreneur, athlete, and coach seems to instinctively know: your success will be defined by your attitude towards the small stuff, the things most people overlook, ignore, or don't care about. The easiest way to do big things is by focusing on the small things. In 2023, my podcast, The Diary of a CEO, became the most downloaded podcast in the UK, according to Apple's end-of-year ranking. It reached the #1 spot in the USA Spotify Business Podcast charts, and for the first time ever, in January gained more subscribers, 320,000, on YouTube than the legendary podcaster Joe Rogan did in the same month. Our podcast is relatively new compared to many of our peers. We only started producing the podcast weekly and in video form just over 2 years ago. I actually don't believe the podcast has been successful because of me as a host. I don't believe that my questions are significantly better, or that our editing is the best, or even that we have the most famous guests in the world. I'm not saying we're bad at these things, but there are others doing those things better. The secret, in my opinion, is that we sweat the smalls more than any other team I have ever encountered. We obsess over thousands of small details that I believe most people would dismiss as trivial, crazy, or a waste of time. To offer just a few examples, before a guest arrives, we research their favorite music and play it softly in the background when they arrive. No guest has ever mentioned this, but we believe that it will put them in a better, more open mood. We've researched the optimal room temperature for a conversation: not too hot, not too cold. We A/B test the title, thumbnail, and promotion of each podcast episode using AI and social media ads weeks before the podcast is published to the public. We've even hired a full-time in-house data scientist and had him create an AI tool that translates the podcast into multiple languages, so if you click on the YouTube version of the podcast while you're in France, for example, both mine and the guests' voices will be automatically translated into French. We've built a data-driven model that informs us which guests we should book, the best performing topics the guest has previously discussed, the optimal length for a conversation, and even how many characters long the title of a podcast should be. Our success can't be attributed to being the best at any one thing, but it can be attributed to our relentless focus on the smallest stuff. Searching for minor, seemingly trivial ways to improve has become our religion. This same meticulous philosophy is embodied by all my companies and is a shared characteristic among the world's most innovative, fast-growing, and disruptive brands. Kaizen. For 77 years, through ups and downs, General Motors, GM, had led the way, with higher car sales annually than any other company globally. But in recent years they've been dethroned by Toyota and its unique approach to building cars, a company, and a culture. Toyota was announced as the world's leading automaker in terms of sales for another consecutive year in 2022. Their year-on-year growth of 9.2% increased the gap with their closest competitor, Volkswagen, by almost 2 million cars sold, compared to the 250,000 gap the year before. Central to the company's success is something called the Toyota Production System. It was developed during the post-Second World War era in Japan, when the country was undergoing reconstruction and facing a shortage of capital and equipment. In response to these challenges, Toyota engineer Taiki Ono formulated a philosophy that allowed the company to extract the maximum potential from each component, machine, and employee. The secret to Toyota's philosophy is a principle known by its Japanese name, Kaizen, which means continuous improvement. In the Kaizen philosophy, innovation is seen as an incremental process. It's not about making big leaps forward, but rather making small things better, in small ways, everywhere you can, on a daily basis. The Kaizen philosophy vehemently rejects the notion that only a select few members of a company's hierarchy are responsible for innovation. It insists that it has to be an everyday task and concern of all employees, at all levels. Because of the Kaizen philosophy, Toyota reportedly implements a staggering 1 million new ideas each year, the majority of which are suggestions made by ordinary factory floor workers. Remarkably, Toyota's US facilities are said to receive 100 times fewer suggestions from their workers than their Japanese counterparts. These suggestions are often tiny, including things like increasing the size of water bottles to better hydrate employees, lowering a shelf to make tools slightly easier to reach, or making the font on a safety warning just 1 point size bigger to reduce accidents. These suggestions may sound insignificant in nature, but the Kaizen philosophy believes that it is in fact the smallest of improvements that will cumulatively push the business forward and keep it ahead of competitors that don't care about sweating the small stuff. Kaizen philosophy says you must create a standard, make sure everyone meets the standard, ask everyone to find ways to improve the standard, and repeat this process forever. Kaizen vs. Convention. Because Toyota is one of Japan's most successful companies, many have assumed its success is down to Japanese culture, pay dynamics, or employee attitudes. But history tells another story. In the early 1980s, during Ronald Reagan's presidency, tensions had been mounting between the United States and Japan over the large number of imported cars flooding American roads. American industry had been struggling. The General Motors plant in Fremont, California, was a prime example of this deterioration. With regards to quality and productivity, it was GM's worst plant by far. It took much longer on average to assemble a vehicle compared to any other plant, and defects in finished cars ran into double digits. The lack of Fremont-built cars in the employee car park clearly showed the absence of employee pride and confidence. The plant had a backlog of some 5,000 union grievances, and there had been a number of strikes and sickouts by the United Auto Workers. Labor conditions were toxic and unsustainable. Huge amounts of temporary workers were needed on any given shift to cover absenteeism rates which exceeded 20%. While special cleaning crews were hired to clear the liquor bottles and drug paraphernalia from the employee car park after each shift. GM viewed the plant as irreversibly broken, and in February, they closed the factory and laid off the entire workforce. Toyota spotted an opportunity to resolve the wider trade frictions and test its Kaizen philosophy on its competitors' home turf. In 1983, Toyota approached GM with the idea of a joint partnership. The Fremont factory would reopen and be renamed New United Motor Manufacturing Incorporated, NUMMI, making the Toyota Corolla and Chevrolet Prism as its primary products. Toyota offered to invest cash, oversee the smooth running of the plant, and implement their philosophy. They even agreed to rehire the same workers, use the same workers' union, the same facilities and the same equipment, despite the terrible failure of the plant just a year earlier. Toyota's former chairman, Eiji Toyoda, believed that this was the necessary first step towards having a wholly owned Toyota manufacturing factory in North America. But he also saw it as the perfect way to test the viability and transportability of the Toyota production system. Toyota hired back almost 90% of the Fremont hourly union workforce and implemented a no-layoff policy, preventing anyone from being fired. They sent 450 group and team leaders to Toyota City to be trained in their unique Kaizen-inspired Toyota production system, at a cost of over $3 million. Under the Toyota philosophy, workers would have a strong voice in plant operations. The workers' old 100-line job descriptions were replaced by 2 words, team member. Management hierarchy was simplified, reduced from 14 levels to just 3, plant management, group leader, team leader. As if by magic, employees who had previously been so disillusioned that they turned against their employers began participating in work-related decisions. They received training in problem-solving and Kaizen practices, so that they became true experts in their respective areas. The parameters of their jobs radically changed as well. Rather than being expected to simply do their bit, they were tasked with proactive thinking and improving. Team members were empowered to quickly implement ideas for improvement, and anything that worked was replicated as best practice. All team members could also stop the entire line at any time to fix a problem by pulling a cord that was accessible from any location in the factory. Within a year of launching in 1985, the NUMMI factory had the highest quality and productivity of any GM plant in the world. Rather than an average of 12 defects per vehicle, it was now just 1, even though cars were assembled in half the time it had previously taken the disgruntled workers. Just 3% of workers was absent at any time, a reflection of the fact that worker satisfaction and engagement had soared. Operational innovation also took off. Employee participation in new ideas exceeded 90%, and management recorded the implementation of nearly 10,000 new ideas. By 1988, NUMMI was winning awards, and by 1990, the Toyota production system and its Kaizen philosophy became the global industry standard for manufacturing. All in under 2 years. The building, workforce, and equipment was unchanged. The philosophy was new and the outcome was radically different. 1% can change your future. The great illusion in life and business that makes the Kaizen philosophy of incremental improvements so poorly adopted, disregarded, and overlooked, is that small things are just small things. This is objectively true, but a large number of small things is a large thing, and it's easier, more inclusive of all team members, and therefore more achievable to aim at improving a large number of small things than it is to galvanize people to find and implement big things. It's an unfortunate reality of life that things that are easy to do are also very easy not to do. It's easy to save $1, so it's also easy not to save it. It's easy to brush your teeth, so it's also easy not to brush your teeth. When things are easy to do, and not to do, the outcome of doing or not doing them is invisible in the short term, so we often choose not to do them. But maths and economics clearly illustrate how our smallest decisions have the biggest impact on our future position. Over time, the difference between allowing something to worsen by 1% each day versus improve by 1% each day becomes extremely significant. Consider this. If you start the year with £100 and manage to improve that value by 1% each day for 365 days, you will have multiplied that value by 37. Over 10 years, assuming the same 1% per day incremental improvement, that value balloons to £15 quadrillion. Conversely, letting that £100 degrade by 1% each day quickly reduces your money to £2.55 after 1 year, 6p after 2 years and 0p thereafter. Not brushing your teeth today will have no visible impact. Not brushing your teeth every day this week might cause a slight smell, but there will be no significant consequences. Not brushing your teeth every day for 5 years will have you screaming in a chair as a dentist rips the molars from your mouth. When did this dental problem occur? It began today, by overlooking something that was easy to do and easy not to do. For Toyota, the Kaizen culture didn't happen overnight. It took 20 years for 2 suggestions per person per year to become standard across the business. Kaizen philosophy takes time, investment and tremendous belief. The art of increasing suggestions. You've seen it everywhere, the company suggestion box, a small opening on top for employee suggestions, a padlock, a general look of neglect. Though it comes from a good place and is well intended, its failure to yield any meaningful results is usually down to 2 factors. 1. A large number of suggestions are usually not creative ideas by Toyota's standards but anonymous complaints, unconstructive criticisms, or passive-aggressive attacks on how the company operates. 2. The few proactive suggestions are either never actioned or cannot possibly be actioned because they are impractical. It is the deadly mix of complaining by the workforce and lack of follow-through by management that leads sadly to the destruction of trust and the dusty death of the suggestion box. So what's different about Japanese companies' Teian, or suggestion systems? Why do they work where other systems fail? Are their employees smarter or more sensible? Are the managers more open to finding useful suggestions among the unhelpful ones? Is it to do with Japanese culture? The answer is much simpler, and unconnected to any national culture. The answer lies with the person we will call the idea coach, and any company can take advantage of this. When Toyota's manager of domestic public relations in Japan, Ron Hay, was asked how they can accept 99% of the ideas that arrive in their suggestion system, he had a telling answer. Ron explained that supervisors reviewed their employees' ideas with them one-on-one, coaching them on the practicalities, giving them direction and support to make the idea well-rounded and effective, and helped it to succeed. This sits in stark contrast to most Western suggestion box systems where the manager says yes or, perhaps more often, no, then explains why an idea will never work. Under the Kaizen system, your supervisor is your idea coach. It remains the employee's idea, but through working with someone who is more experienced with a deeper understanding of the art of the possible, 99% of ideas are accepted and collaboratively developed into something that could work. All employees at Toyota are tasked with coming up with at least 1 idea per month, making it a central part of everyone's role. Supervisors are also tasked with making sure each of their team members succeeds in coming up with at least 1 idea per month. This ensures that everyone is rowing in the same direction. It's in everyone's best interests to help ideas succeed. Coaches also have coaches. Each supervisor has a coach above them, who is incentivized to help the supervisor develop enough new ideas each month. In this way, everyone from the top to the bottom of the company is positively encouraged to listen, to refine, and to support all new suggestions. Critically, the person who implements the idea has to be the one who had it in the first place. You can imagine how this principle alone alters the types of suggestions people make. A criticism is no longer an idea. "I hate the office music," can't be a suggestion, as under this principle every idea must be practical, productive, and focused on a solution. Finally, Toyota employees are all provided with an education in Kaizen, the Toyota production system, and how the idea suggestion process works. It's exceptionally rare for Western counterparts to educate their teams on the philosophy of incremental gains, how to properly formulate suggestions and the rationale behind their philosophy. Avoid paying for suggestions. Companies tend to treat employees like rats in a maze sprinting after cheese by paying them for the behavior they want to reinforce. This is the easy, less effective, short-term, costly approach. The harder, more effective, cheaper approach is to create a culture where people care enough, are motivated enough and are recognized sufficiently enough to step forward, contribute and invest their energy in the betterment of the company. Under the Kaizen philosophy, you need lots of ideas, very often, to make meaningful progress over time. And in order to get lots of ideas, you need people to be driven by their own curiosity, motivation, and care. There's a famous fable that illustrates this idea well. There was once an old woman, who lived alone. Every afternoon, her peace and quiet was disrupted by children playing noisily on the street outside her house. As time went on, the children got noisier and noisier, and the woman became more and more infuriated. One day she had an idea. She called them over and explained to them amiably that hearing them playing joyfully outside was the highlight of her day, but that there was a problem. In her old age and isolation, she was going deaf. So, she asked, would they be willing to make even more of a racket, just for her? She went one step further, offering them each a quarter for their trouble. The next day, the kids eagerly returned and made a huge din outside her house. As requested, they were each paid their 25 cents and asked to return the next day. But this time, the woman only paid them 20 cents. And the following day it was just 15 cents. The poor old woman explained that she was running out of money, and that their fee would drop to a nickel a day from now on. The kids were appalled at the prospect of earning a fifth of what they were earning just days before. They stormed off and pledged never to return. It was simply not worth the effort, they said, for just 5 cents a day. The woman's clever idea was to take the joy out of the thing the children loved doing and were doing for free. The bigger lesson is clear, though. It's possible to replace a genuine motivation with a synthetic one. This phenomenon is also known as motivation crowding. If you attach a financial reward to ideas, it can interfere with or even eliminate people's genuine creative energy and ambition. This is more than a fable, this is science. I interviewed motivation expert and author Daniel Pink about the impact financial rewards have on our motivation, and he shared a plethora of research that shows that paying someone to do something that they once did for fun will cause them to lose the intrinsic joy of doing that task. When a hobby becomes a job, motivation drops. Scholars at the London School of Economics and Political Science looked at 51 studies on pay-for-performance schemes and stated, "We find that financial incentives may indeed reduce intrinsic motivation and diminish ethical or other reasons for complying with workplace social norms such as fairness. As a consequence, the provision of financial incentives can result in a negative impact on overall performance." Innovation distortion. Innovation is often portrayed as a miraculous occurrence, something that only arises from the genius of a select few or the luck of a fortunate accident. The light bulb, Velcro, penicillin, and post-it notes are just a few examples that perpetuate this misleading belief. The painful, incremental process behind the breakthrough is nearly always neglected in the retelling of these stories of invention, which only highlight the final outcome. Don't let these myths deceive you. True innovation is nearly always born from the sweat and determination of persistent individuals and great teams bound together by the right culture and philosophy, not from eureka moments, accidental fortune, or intentional genius. In all the companies I've founded that have reached the summit of their industry, there was no one decision, invention, or innovation that got us there. My central focus has always been to get our teams to outcare the competition. Creating a culture through recognition, celebration, and evidence, which continually proved to all of us that the smallest of things, the easiest and most accessible things, can have the biggest of impacts. 1% is the most repeated phrase in my companies, and one of my key responsibilities as CEO is identifying and encouraging those 1%er gains, wherever they might arise within the company. The law, you must sweat the small stuff. I've always felt that I have a cheat code. While our competitors think consistency or big wins are the paths to the podium, I know, without a shadow of a doubt, the correct route is to be found by making consistently small improvements, sweating the smallest stuff and fighting for tiny gains. If you don't care about tiny details, you'll produce bad work because good work is the culmination of hundreds of tiny details. The world's most successful people all sweat the smalls too. Law 20. A small miss now creates a big miss later. This law reveals why most people end up lost in their relationships and work because they've overlooked one simple, ongoing discipline in their lives. Asked to explain how Tiger Woods became one of the greatest golfers of all time, most of us would reel off the same well-known facts. He was a child prodigy, his talent already apparent when he was just 2 years old. He devoted his life to training, famously spending hours analyzing footage of his performance. His own father described him as the chosen one and had unshakable belief in his potential. But those who really know Woods will tell you it's his Kaizen philosophy of obsessive, continuous tiny improvements that deserves the credit for his accomplishments. In 1997, after the Masters tournament and just 7 months after turning professional, Woods told his coach, Butch Harmon, that he wanted to rework, effectively rebuild, his entire swing from scratch. Harmon warned Woods that there were no shortcuts, that it would be a long journey, and that his performance at tournaments would get much worse before he saw any improvement. Friends, fellow players, and experts agreed, but Woods knew his swing could be marginally better, so he ignored them. He viewed reinventing his swing not as a threat to his game, but an opportunity to incrementally improve it, and so he took the chance and started his Kaizen journey. Woods was directly inspired by Toyota's quest for perfection, and began to speak of the Kaizen philosophy as if it were his religion. He and his coach went on to create their own Kaizenesque sequence of hitting practice balls repeatedly, reviewing footage of his swing to discover improvements, implementing any improvements in the gym and on the course, and repeat. Just as his coach predicted, it was a long road. Woods stopped winning. In fact, he didn't win anything for 18 months, and pundits began to say it was all over for him. But Woods and his coaches had faith that small improvements would show up after longer periods of time. He told his critics, winning is not always the barometer of getting better. Woods' Kaizen attitude paid off. His new swing would develop into a lethal weapon, more precise, more accurate, and more versatile than ever before. He enjoyed a record 6 straight wins starting in late 1999, and since then, Tiger Woods has arguably become the best golfer of all time, with 82 PGA Tour wins, more than anyone has ever achieved before. Woods proves that the pursuit of perfection is a matter of discipline, not being heroic. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and survival of the fittest posits that not making small adaptations can result in extinction, while small mutations create a survival advantage. This idea serves as a fitting analogy for the Kaizen philosophy. As Charles Darwin argued, an individual's success won't be determined by a single stroke of genius. Instead, it will be the byproduct of a philosophy that fosters gradual evolution, mutation, and adaptation in any and every aspect of an organism, over an extended period of time. In aviation, there's a principle called the 1 in 60 rule, which means that being off target by 1 degree will lead to a plane missing its end destination by 1 mile for every 60 miles flown. This concept also applies to our lives, careers, relationships, and personal growth. Just a small deviation from the optimal route is amplified over time and distance. Something that feels like a small miss now can create a big miss later. This highlights the need for the real-time course corrections and adjustments that the Kaizen philosophy provides. If we are to be successful, we all need simple rituals to assess our course and make the necessary small adjustments, as frequently as possible, in all aspects of our lives. John Gottman, the acclaimed relationship psychologist, concluded from decades of research that the existence of contempt in a relationship is the biggest predictor of divorce. Contempt is the subtle disrespect and disregard of your partner. Like an aircraft being 1 degree off course, the harm happens slowly, over time, in relationships where the couple fail at conflict resolution because of poor or infrequent communication. This insight led me to establish one of the most important Kaizen-style rituals I have in my romantic relationship, a scheduled weekly check-in with my partner. We sit down, talk openly, and seek marginal ways to improve, align and resolve unaddressed issues, both small and large. In one of our recent check-ins, she mentioned that my response of, "Sorry, I'm busy with something," when interrupted while working can come across as blunt and irritated. She asked if I could add a loving word to my response to soften the message. My unintentional bluntness had been making her feel subtly rejected. Now, instead of sounding like a grumpy workaholic, I say, "Sorry, love, I'm busy with something." Although it seems like a minor change, expressing and rectifying this issue has prevented it from compounding over time and causing a big problem later. Like a plane slightly off course, we've nudged our relationship back on track by 1 degree so that we can continue in the right direction. I apply the same principles to business, friendships, and my relationship with myself. I have weekly check-ins with my directors and friends, and even a self-assessment in my diary to ensure everything is on course, aligned, and that any necessary course corrections are identified and implemented. Week after week, my inbox is flooded with messages from individuals who have found themselves lost in their careers, businesses, relationships, and friendships. In nearly every instance, it eventually becomes evident that their present circumstances are a consequence of neglecting small things for an extended period of time. They failed to check in with themselves and others, speak up, engage in difficult conversations, or address the seemingly trivial issues in their lives. Consequently, they veered off course ever so slightly, by a mere 1 degree, which ultimately led them to a destination they didn't want to go to. The law, a small miss now creates a big miss later. The Kaizen philosophy isn't just about business, efficiencies, or improvements, it's about continually ensuring you're on the right path and heading to the destination that you intend to, want to, and desire to visit. The smallest seeds of today's negligence will bloom into tomorrow's biggest regrets. Law 21. You must outfail the competition. This law proves that the higher your failure rate, the higher your chances of success. It will inspire you to start failing much faster than you currently are. Thomas J. Watson was president of IBM for an incredible 38 years, was one of the most notable entrepreneurs in the USA in the first half of the 20th century, alongside Henry Ford, and he became one of the richest men of his time because of his enormous success at IBM. His core principle of innovation could be summed up in a simple sentence: if you want to increase your success rate, double your failure rate. He also said, "Every time we've moved ahead in IBM, it was because someone was willing to take a chance, put their head on the block, and try something new." When he was asked if he was going to fire a male employee who made a mistake that had cost the company $600,000, he swiftly replied, "No, I just spent $600,000 training him. Why would I want somebody to hire his experience?" He instinctively understood that failure was both an opportunity for progress, and that the opposite, a lack of failure, would be the death of IBM. He warned against complacency, even when IBM reached the top of their industry, and in line with the Kaizen approach, he said, "Whenever an individual or a business decides that success has been attained, progress stops." Even before I had heard about Thomas J. Watson and his unconventional perspective on failure, I spent 10 years encouraging, measuring, and driving up my team's failure rate. We all know failure is feedback, and we can agree that feedback is knowledge, and as the cliché asserts, knowledge is power. Therefore, failure is power, and if you want to increase your chances of success, you must increase your failure rate. Those who fail to constantly fail are destined to be the eternal followers. Those that outfail their competition will be followed forever. How to increase your failure rate? Booking.com is the largest and most successful hotel booking site in the world. But, like every industry leader, it started small, broken and behind. Gillian Tans, Booking.com's former CEO, said, "Many companies start with a nice product and market it all over the world. Booking did the opposite. We had a basic product and then worked hard to figure out what customers wanted. We failed so many times." A few years after launching, a Booking.com engineer attended a conference in 2004, where he heard Microsoft's Ronnie Kohavi on the importance of experimentation and failure. He took the learnings back to his team at Booking.com, where there were constant, time-wasting disagreements about the next step forward, the right features to implement and the direction to take. They began to learn what customers wanted through simple experiments, and then used those insights to build a product, the Booking.com we know today. As Tans says, "We grew like this, without any marketing or PR, just constant testing and experimentation of what our customers liked." Having seen the success that increasing experimentation and failure had had on the firm, Booking.com developed and launched its own experimentation platform in 2005 that allowed it to tremendously scale up the amount of tests it was running. Adrian Ingest, Senior Director of Product Development at Booking.com, recalled, "I came from small businesses where CEOs launched a big product redesign every 6 months, and by the time you rolled it out, it was hard to figure out what worked and what did not work. Here, the team was small, fitted on one floor, and it was exciting to see everyone take risks, fail, push small changes very quickly, and use experiments to measure the impact." Booking.com would go as far as appointing a director of experimentation, who has publicly evangelized about how critical it is for companies to fail more often and measure those experiments, saying, "We believe that controlled experimentation is the most successful approach to building products that customers want." Today Booking.com has 20,300 employees and $10 billion in annual revenue. The website is available in 43 languages and features over 28 million listings in every corner of the world. And in the moment that you're reading this, 1,000 experiments are being run by Booking.com, led and devised by every single product and technology team they have. They credit their culture of outfailing their competition as being a key reason why they've overtaken their competition. Amazon follows the same fail faster religion. Jeff Bezos, founder of the trillion-dollar e-commerce platform, sent the following memo to his shareholders when the company became the fastest ever to reach annual sales of $100 billion. "One area where I think we are especially distinctive is failure. I believe we are the best place in the world to fail. We have plenty of practice, and failure and invention are inseparable twins. To invent you have to experiment, and if you know in advance that it's going to work, it's not an experiment. Most large organizations embrace the idea of invention, but are not willing to suffer the string of failed experiments necessary to get there. Outsized returns often come from betting against conventional wisdom, and conventional wisdom is usually right. Given a 10% chance of a 100 times payoff, you should take that bet every time. But you're still going to be wrong 9 times out of 10. We all know that if you swing for the fences, you're going to strike out a lot, but you're also going to hit some home runs. The difference between baseball and business, however, is that baseball has a truncated outcome distribution. When you swing, no matter how well you connect with the ball, the most runs you can get is 4. In business, every once in a while, when you step up to the plate, you can score 1,000 runs. This long-tailed distribution of returns is why it's important to be bold. Big winners pay for so many experiments. In a related interview, Jeff Bezos expanded upon this idea. To be innovative, you have to experiment. You need to do more experiments per week, per month, per year, per decade. It's that simple. You cannot invent without experimenting. We want failures where we're trying to do something new, untested, never proven. That's a real experiment. And they come in all scale sizes. Amazon has one of the biggest business graveyards of failure, something I'm sure Bezos is proud of. A9.com, the Amazon search engine, the Fire Phone and their Endless.com shoe website are just some of the notable projects that were so unsuccessful you've probably never heard about them. However, when one of their experiments pays off, it completely changes the trajectory of their business, and covers the losses of all of their failures combined. Amazon Prime, Amazon Echo, the Kindle and, most notably, Amazon Web Services, AWS. AWS was launched as an experiment unrelated to Amazon's e-commerce business, but in 20 years has become the fastest growing B2B company of all time. It is the world's top cloud computing platform. It has operations in 24 geographical regions and boasts over 1 million active users in 190 countries, $62 billion in revenue and $18.5 billion in annual profit. In 2022, That little experiment from 20 years ago was the single biggest contributor to Amazon's total profit. In 2011, Amazon created its very own experimentation platform, WebLab, which now runs more than 20,000 experiments each year to continuously innovate and improve on customer experiences. Jeff Bezos explained how Amazon decides which experiments a company should pursue in his 2015 shareholder letter. Some decisions are consequential and irreversible or nearly irreversible, one-way doors, and these decisions must be made methodically, carefully, slowly, with great deliberation and consultation. If you walk through and don't like what you see on the other side, you can't get back to where you were before. We can call these type 1 decisions. But most decisions aren't like that, they are changeable, reversible, they're two-way doors. If you've made a suboptimal type 2 decision, you don't have to live with the consequences for that long. You can reopen the door and go back through. Type 2 decisions can and should be made quickly by high-judgment individuals or small groups. As organizations get larger, there seems to be a tendency to use the heavyweight type 1 decision-making process on most decisions, including many type 2 decisions. The end result of this is slowness, unthoughtful risk aversion, failure to experiment sufficiently, and consequently diminished invention. A battle between father and son. For 6 years I advised an industry-leading, multi-billion-dollar e-commerce company in the food industry that had 2 brands underneath it. One brand was run by the father, who had founded the whole group, and the other, much newer brand had been launched by the son. When my company was appointed to help them scale their marketing, customer acquisition, social media, and innovation efforts, I initially spent up to 4 days a week in the boardroom with both the father and the son, understanding their brands, their goals, and their objectives. I visited both brands every week without fail. I traveled the world with them. I was in the room, doing everything from advising their crisis management press releases to producing their social media strategy and advising them on which marketing activities to pursue. When they went to Paris to launch a new product, I was on the plane. If they had an event in America, I was there. If they had an important meeting in Singapore, I traveled with them, and when they launched in the Middle East, I was on the ground. In the 6 years that I advised them and acted as a member of their extended family, I watched the son's part of the company go from an unknown, small, unprofitable brand to the best-loved, most culturally relevant, highest-grossing brand in its industry. At the same time, I saw the father's brand falter, stagnate, and slow down. Ultimately the son's brand would overtake his father's, generating more than $1 billion in revenue. I had front-row seats to both businesses, their decisions, and their philosophy, and I can say with total confidence that the most significant reason why the son overtook his father is that the son had a failure rate that exceeded that of his father by a factor of 10. When my teams made a technological discovery relating to marketing, growth or social media, we brought it to both brands at the same time, on the same day, but we were greeted with very different responses. I recall one such innovation where we found a way to grow their social media following 20 times faster than usually possible using a technique we'd discovered with a particular platform. I personally took this discovery to both the son and the father in 2016, in 2 separate meetings. The father's team listened to the idea, requested a bigger presentation, scoffed at our fee, and they informed me that they would need various layers of sign-off to proceed. 9 months later, they were still discussing it internally. The son didn't put me in front of a team at first. He wanted to hear the idea himself. Before I could even finish my explanation, he called out to his assistant, "Bring all of the marketing team into the room ASAP." When the marketing team arrived, he told me to repeat what I had just said, and upon finishing my explanation, he looked at his team and remarked, "We're going to do this today." He looked back at me and said, "Stephen, whatever you need, it's sorted, full steam ahead, right now. No contracts, no lawyers, no layers of sign-off, no delays, trust, speed, and empowerment." That one idea resulted in the son's brand adding 10 million more followers to one of its social media channels over the following months. In the end, it cost them 95% or less to grow their social media page using our discovery, than all the strategies that the brand had adopted in the past. The son instinctively knew that this was a type 2 decision, the sort of decision that wouldn't have irreversible harm if it failed, could be reversed, but also could ultimately change the course of the brand if it succeeded. And he knew that in the face of a type 2 decision, Jeff Bezos's words should be followed, Type 2 decisions can and should be made quickly by high-judgment individuals or small groups. The son knew that the biggest cost wasn't failing, it was missing an opportunity to grow and wasting time to learn a new lesson regardless of the outcome. If the experiment had failed, it would have cost them one day and a little money, and we'd be on to the next experiment within 24 hours, one failure closer to the right answer. By the time the father's brand had decided to cautiously proceed with the idea, some 10 months later, it no longer worked, the platform loophole we were using had been closed, and growing a social media channel had once again become expensive, complicated, and difficult. It's important to note that most of the ideas we brought to the sun didn't have such astonishing results. Most experiments fail, no matter how well designed. I would estimate that 3 in 10 were tragic failures, 3 in 10 were average failures, 3 in 10 were good, and 1 in 10 was great, so great that it changed the fortunes of their business and paid for any losses incurred by the other 9. Get to 51% certainty, and make the decision. Many years later I would have the honor of sharing the same stage as Barack Obama in Brazil, and Obama would remark that when facing tough decisions, like whether or not to fly into Pakistan unannounced at night in the hope of assassinating Osama bin Laden, he turned to probability instead of certainty. He said every decision was painstakingly difficult. If it was an easily solvable problem, or even a modestly difficult but solvable problem, it would not reach me, because, by definition, somebody else would have solved it. Instead of saying, will X or Y happen if I make this decision, he would say, what is the chance of X or Y occurring? He insisted that having smarter people in the room was key. Having the confidence to have people around you who were smarter than you or disagreed with you is critical. And he would weigh each decision not just on the probability of being right, but the impact it would have if he was wrong. You don't have to get to 100% certainty on your big decisions, get to 51% and when you get there, make the decision quickly and be at peace with the fact that you made the decision based on the information you had. As I came to learn from working with the father and sons companies, from my more than 10 years advising the world's leading brands, and from Barack Obama, the truth is that perfect decisions exist only in hindsight. Dwelling too long on potential outcomes, and procrastinating in the process, is futile. The real cost of indecision in business is wasted time. That time could have been used failing your way to knowledge that would ultimately help you to succeed. Instead, some brands freeze in fear, and in their attempt to avert any losses, they end up losing the most expensive and important things: opportunity, knowledge, and time. Nassim Taleb, author and researcher, sums it up in this graph. Creating a pro-failure philosophy. Some of the companies I worked with got this right. They had lightning-fast experimentation cycles, they viewed change as an opportunity, they outfailed their competition and they nearly always outpaced their industry. Some of the companies I worked with believed in this philosophy, tried it and failed. They asked their teams to innovate more, wrote it on the office wall, but it simply never happened. And some companies didn't believe in it at all. Those companies were almost never founder-led, they were either stagnant or in decline, and they viewed the changing world as nothing more than a threat. I discovered 5 consistent principles that the most innovative companies naturally embodied, which I believe enable teams to outfail their competition. Remove bureaucracy. It is a villain, says Walmart CEO Doug McMillon. Its tentacles should be treated like the cancers they so much resemble, says Berkshire Hathaway Vice Chair Charlie Munger. It's a disease, says Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. All of these esteemed business leaders are talking about bureaucracy, a word that seems to have no successful fans. In simple terms, the worst corporate bureaucracies are companies with lots of rules, long and painful sign-off processes, and several layers of hierarchy between the bottom and the top. These systems disempower employees, slow companies down, disincentivize experimentation, delay innovation and stifle the gold mine of ideas that exist in the minds of the workforce. Systems like this are attacks on human ingenuity, energy, and entrepreneurism. As Lawrence Peter, author of the Peter Principle, put it, bureaucracy defends the status quo long past the time the quo has lost its status. Bureaucracy is often seen by company leaders as an unfortunate necessity for businesses operating in complex regulatory and international environments. The U.S. workforce is an example of this. Since 1983, The number of managers, supervisors, and administrators has increased by over 100% in comparison to an increase of roughly 40% for all other occupations. In recent years, nearly two-thirds of workers said their organizations had become more bureaucratic, according to a Harvard Business Review survey. Meanwhile, productivity growth has stalled. In the bigger companies that have come to dominate Western economies, bureaucracy is particularly detrimental. In the U.S. labor force, over one-third of workers are employed in firms of 5,000 or more employees, and frontline workers are generally overseen by 8 management levels. Considering the astounding speed of change happening in the world, as revealed in Law 5, doing anything to slow down your company's rate of experimentation at this point in history is a death wish. Haier Group, a Chinese appliance business that generates more than $35 billion in annual sales, understands this better than anyone. To avoid the toxic consequences of bureaucracy, they've divided their 75,000 employees into 4,000 micro-organizations, most of which have just 10 to 15 employees. Decisions are made at lightning speed by small, autonomous teams, and subsequently they've managed to outfail their competition, innovate at the speed of the market, and dominate their industry. And Steve Jobs, co-founder and CEO of Apple, when speaking about bureaucracy at the company, said, "We are organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet, and we all meet for 3 hours once a week and we talk about everything we're doing. Teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're going to come through with their parts. And that's what we do really well. The key, as I've witnessed in all of my own companies, clients, and case studies, is to make project teams as small as they can possibly be, to give them more authority, trust, and access to resources when making decisions, and to cut back all sign-off processes, especially when a team is seeking to make a Type 2, low-consequence, reversible decision. Fix the incentives." In 2020, my company was tasked with resuscitating a faltering fashion e-commerce company that was on the brink of financial collapse. The COVID-19 pandemic had prompted the closure of their physical stores, resulting in a reduction of staff and wages. Employee morale was on its knees, and a new CEO had recently been appointed to steer the company in a new direction. During my first presentation to the CEO, I outlined the need for the company to increase their rate of failure by an order of magnitude in all areas, including marketing. They were lagging behind their competitors, missing opportunities, and squandering resources on ineffective traditional tactics. Upon hearing my proposal, the CEO mentioned that the company already encouraged their team to experiment more, citing the inclusion of fail faster as one of their 4 core values in the employee handbook, and 2 of the words prominently displayed on the office kitchen wall. Following my presentation, I held private sessions with staff, from managers to interns, for several hours. During a meeting with the brand's marketing team, I posed the question, "What reason do you have to fail more often?" A prolonged, revealing silence ensued before I rephrased the question, asking, "What reason have you got not to fail more often?" The marketing manager's previously paralysed mouth sprang to life as she drowned me with a series of responses, including, "I don't want to be embarrassed, I won't receive a pay increase, people will think less of me, I might be fired, I'm too busy to try new things." As she rattled off more and more reasons, it became increasingly apparent that the organization was plagued by a disease called misaligned incentives. What the company expected of its employees was not in line with what it incentivized them to do. The company wanted innovators, risk-takers, entrepreneurs, but, upon close inspection, as is the case in most slow, dying companies, people were simply incentivized to do their job, no less, no more. It is startling to me, still, that any CEO would believe that the cute words, cliched slogans, and aspirational values they put in employee handbooks matter at all. Words need evidence, incentives, and examples to bring them to life. Human behavior is not driven by platitudes, slogans, and wishful thinking. If you want to predict what a group of people will do over the long term, you need to look at their incentives, not their instructions. To redesign the incentives of the marketing department, one of the many systems I implemented was a recognition process designed to celebrate an employee or team when an experiment was successfully executed, regardless of the outcome. After all, executing the experiment is the controllable factor, whether it's successful or not in the market is impossible to control, so it's not where our incentives should focus. Promote and fire. I told the CEO of the fashion company to identify the employees that were failing the fastest and to promote them as high in the organization as she could. Companies don't have one company culture, every manager in an organization creates a subculture underneath them. At my first marketing company we had almost 30 managers, and I observed time and time again how one team's satisfaction, attitude, and philosophy could be starkly different to the team they were sat next to, purely because of their manager. With 30 managers, we really had 30 company cultures. Influence trickles down. You need the people at the highest point in the company to be the most avid disciples of your cultural values. When you promote those employees, or give them pay rises, let all team members know why they're being promoted, and point out their exceptionally high failure rate. Conversely, it's important to swiftly remove individuals from the team that stand in the way of the flow of new ideas, fast failure, and experimentation. Especially if those employees are managers, one bad manager can destroy the morale, motivation, and optimism of a great team of perfectly capable, hopeful and entrepreneurial employees. Measure accurately. While advising the fashion e-commerce business, I asked the CEO to establish, educate, and continually communicate to all team members an experimentation process that everyone should follow, use to measure, and use to communicate a new idea or experiment that they wanted to pursue. Too often employees don't step forward with new ideas because they're unclear on the process they should follow. Education is the easiest way to remove operational psychological friction. And lastly, I told the CEO to measure, team by team, the organization's failure rate, with a clear goal of increasing every team's failure rate by a factor of 10 by year end. In business, you don't improve what you don't measure, and what you focus on grows. By establishing visible KPIs, key performance indicators, and clear goals, and making them everyone's responsibility, nobody at the fashion business could be too busy for experimentation. As is the case under the Kaizen philosophy, it became a central part of everyone's job. The organization slowly changed direction, breaking even for the first time in 7 years in the first year, and turning a sizable profit in the second. Its newfound creativity, innovation, and empowered workforce made it feel like a brand new company. Staff retention rates improved, employee satisfaction scores soared, and the company innovated more than ever before. Share the failure. If you want to maximize the return from every failure, it is crucial to disseminate the details of each failed hypothesis, experiment, and outcome throughout your organization. This information represents a form of intellectual capital that can serve as a foundation for future experiments. By openly sharing failures, you can prevent the duplication of unsuccessful efforts, stimulate the development of new ideas, and foster a culture of continuous experimentation. As Thomas Edison said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." The law: you must outfail the competition. Failure is not a bad thing, and to increase your chances of success you need to increase your failure rate. Every time something is tried and found not to work, valuable information is gained that can be shared with your team. Businesses that experiment faster, fail faster, and then continue to experiment, nearly always outpace the competition. Failure equals feedback. Feedback equals knowledge. Knowledge equals power. Failure gives you power. Law 22. You must become a Plan A thinker. This law will demonstrate why your Plan B in life might just be the biggest hurdle to the success of your Plan A. The story I'm about to tell you changed my life. On Friday, October 13, 1972, Nando Pereira woke up after being unconscious for 48 hours. He wasn't coming round after an operation or emerging from some 2-day bender. He was surrounded by dead bodies and injured friends, thousands of feet above sea level in a glacial valley in the Andes, amidst the wreckage of an airplane crash, with no means of calling for help or even working out exactly where they were. Of the 45 passengers, members of a Uruguayan rugby team on their way to Chile for a match, 29 survived the crash. Initially they did what they could, drinking melted snow and eating whatever they could salvage from their luggage. On the first day, recalled Pereira, I slowly sucked the chocolate off the peanut. On the second day, I sucked gently on the peanut for hours, allowing myself only a tiny nibble now and then. I did the same on the third day, and when I finally nibbled the peanut down to nothing, there was no food left at all. A full week later, facing the threat of starvation and knowing, after finding a transistor radio, that the Chilean authorities had called off their search efforts, Nando and his fellow survivors did the unimaginable. They decided they had no choice but to eat the dead bodies. Among the few women on the plane had been Peredo's mother and little sister, whom he had invited on the trip to watch him play. His mother, Xenia, 49, died instantly on impact. His little sister, Susie, initially survived the crash but died in her brother's arms a week later. The first body they ate was the pilot's, since they held him responsible for the crash. Other bodies, the survivors agreed, were off limits, including those of Xenia and Susie. But Peredo became tormented by the idea that someone would violate their agreement, and he couldn't live with himself if that happened. 2 months after the crash, Peredo announced that he was setting off to find help. He was starved, had no mountaineering experience, and no idea where he was going, but somehow this was a better option than eating the bodies of his mother and sister. I didn't want to have to eat their bodies, I didn't want to face that moment, he said. Nando and his friend Robert sewed together material for a sleeping bag and knocked together a sled, then set off. They decided to ascend rather than descend, since a higher vantage point would give them a better chance of working out an escape route. It took them 3 grueling days and they somehow made it to the top of a 15,000-foot peak 3 days later, but didn't find what they were hoping for. What I saw when we reached the peak of the first mountain really froze me. I couldn't breathe, speak, or think. What I saw was horrible. Instead of green valleys, we saw mountains and snow-covered peaks, 360 degrees around us, stretching as far as we could see into the horizon. And that's when I knew I was dead. But there is no way that I can go back and eat the bodies of my mother and sister. The only way is forward. We will die, but we will die trying. I will keep on going until I stop breathing. They staggered down the other side of the mountain and began to force themselves along the glacier below, growing ever weaker. Day by day, the pair limped on for 10 days through the ice-cold mountains, deep snow, and deadly crevasses. It was a blurry, continuous, painful effort. The mountains were so huge that it feels like you are not making any progress. You would set yourself a target location in the distance, and you would think it would take 2 or 3 hours to get there, but it was so huge that you never seemed to get there, he said. Sickness set in, the men's bodies began to shut down, and then on December 18th, they came upon a river. As they followed it, they saw signs that someone had been there recently, a soup can, a horseshoe, even a herd of cows, until finally on December 20th, they spotted a man on horseback on the other side of a huge river. The men couldn't make themselves heard above the roar of the river, so Peredo mimed an aeroplane crashing to try to explain who they were, though he worried the man would think he was mad and ride off. Instead, the man tied a note to a rock and threw it across the river. "Tell me what you want." Peredo wrote back, "I come from a plane that fell into the mountains. We have been walking for 10 days. We have no food, and I can no longer walk." He explained that he had 14 friends remaining in the mountains alive, and that they desperately needed help. The man received the note and was shocked, but believing what he read, he traveled for 10 hours on horseback to the nearest civilization and returned the next day with a rescue team. Miraculously, 72 days after the plane crash, Peredo and his friend were saved, and the next day he took the rescue team back to the crash site in a helicopter, where the 14 other survivors would be found and rescued. "The only way you go forward is because you can't go back," he explained. Peredo's story is a story of human perseverance, fortitude, and courage, in the face of hopeless desperation. I stumbled across his story at 19 years old, while I was in a dire financial situation. Trying to pursue my first business idea, disowned by my parents for dropping out of university, shoplifting, and scavenging food on my worst days, while living in a deprived area of the country, alone and broke. His story changed my life. It gave me hope in my darkest time, wind in my sails when I needed it the most, and more reason to push on despite the circumstance I was in. After several years of perseverance, I too had escaped my situation. I had built a successful company, I was financially free, and my life resembled that of my wildest dreams. The only way you go forward is because you cannot go back. I couldn't go back. I had nowhere back to go. Not having a plan B became the most incredible motivational force in my life. When the human mind excludes all other possibilities and fixates on a single path, that path draws in every available ounce of your passion, perseverance, and power, leaving no room for hesitation or deviation. The first step before anybody else in the world believes it is you have to believe it. There is no reason to have a plan B, because it distracts from plan A. Will Smith. Had I had an alternate path available to me, it's entirely possible that those darkest of hours might have lured me down it. This might sound like cute but meaningless motivational words or an unrealistic platitude, but amazingly, researchers have recently revealed that having a plan B, in any ambition, has a net negative impact on our chances of succeeding with our plan A. Maybe we should put all our eggs in one basket. You've probably heard the advice, don't put all your eggs in one basket. When it comes to choosing a career or applying to university, or even applying for a new job, having a backup plan is widely thought to be a good idea. Studies have shown that this approach does help to alleviate some of the psychological discomfort associated with uncertainty, but astoundingly new research has also shown that it comes at a big cost. Having a backup plan, or even considering one, has been shown to potentially hinder your performance by making you less driven to hit your primary goal. Across 3 studies, almost 500 students were asked to solve a difficult word puzzle that involved unscrambling muddled sentences. If they were successful, they would be given a delicious snack. Before attempting the puzzle, some groups of students were told to think through a backup plan, other ways they could get a free snack on campus, if they couldn't unscramble the sentences. Researchers found that the groups that had no plan B performed radically better than the backup plan groups. They had higher levels of motivation, valued success more, and solved more of the puzzle. Subsequent experiments have replicated the results in other contexts with different rewards, example money, other prizes and saved time, and the results were always the same. One of the researchers, behavioral scientist Katie Milkman, concluded, this suggests that thinking through a backup plan will actually make you want to achieve your goal less, which then hurts your effort, performance, and ultimately, your chances of successfully achieving your goal. These findings apply to goals where success is highly dependent on effort. Additionally, while some can feel frozen by their fear of failure, research shows that the fear of failure can actually provide the impetus needed to get to your goal. In a similar vein, other research has shown that the more you perceive negative emotions in the event of failure, the more driven you will be to succeed. However, if you have a backup plan, the incentive to succeed is lessened because you have removed the fear of failure. Being risky doesn't mean being reckless. If you're reading this and it's made you consider making a deadly 10-day trek across the Andes Mountains, I need to provide a disclaimer. There is a difference between taking a risk, focusing your entire being on a goal, and being outright reckless. In my story, of course, I was not at risk of death. I'm fortunate enough to live in a society that would have caught me, fed me, and housed me, if I had needed catching. And many of you will have dependents, mortgages and other responsibilities that you understandably need to protect. Practicality must be a priority. The law, you must become a Plan A thinker. This law remains one of those uncomfortable, unavoidable realities of the human condition. The amount of ourselves that we can dedicate to an outcome, mind, energy, and focus, is positively correlated with the likelihood of that outcome. Some call this manifestation, but I call it Plan A thinking. In the pursuit of your most important goals, a backup plan is an additional weight to carry, a motivational burden to bring and distracting companion to call. There's no greater force of creativity, determination and commitment than a person who is tracked by a Plan B. Law 23. Don't be an ostrich. In this law you'll learn why my biggest professional mistake in business was behaving like an ostrich when I should have acted like a lion. In your career, being an ostrich will get you killed. This law will teach you how to avoid being an ostrich. God himself could not sink this ship, said Edward Smith, captain of the Titanic, as people warned him of the dangers of ice in the area. Hours later, when the ship struck an iceberg, and began to flood and sink, First Officer Murdoch, who had been on watch at the time of the collision, is reported to have turned to Chief Steward John Hardy and said, "I believe the Titanic is gone, Hardy." Despite their looming fate, passengers later recalled a bizarre sense of calm, disbelief, and normality on the decks. There were some people who were playing cards, and there was one man who was playing the violin. They were just as calm as if they were in a drawing room, said passenger Edith Russell. Another passenger, Ellen Bird, described how some people seemed to completely ignore their impending fate. I saw 1 or 2 men and women get up, look out of the window, and then sit down again, evidently with the idea that they would go back to bed. William Carter, who survived by climbing into a collapsible boat, one of the last lifeboats to get away, said he had tried to convince George Widener to come with him in the lifeboat. Carter said that Widener ignored his warning and said, "I think I'd rather take my chances." Consequently, the already limited number of lifeboats were leaving partially empty. As the situation grew more dire, crew members began to frantically blow whistles, panic and shout orders to try to get the passengers to the lifeboats. According to survivor accounts, some of the crew members had to physically force people to board lifeboats, against their will. Very late in the sinking, just minutes before the boat was completely submerged, when most of the decks were completely flooded, widespread panic did begin. Second Officer Lightoller had to brandish his gun and Fifth Officer Lowe actually fired shots along the side of the ship to keep people from swamping the last lifeboats as they were being loaded and lowered. One frantic crew member even entered the radio room and attempted to steal the senior wireless officer Jack Phillips's life belt as he was working the radio. Consequently, of the 2,240 people on board, almost 70% of them died. Such denial is a complicated thing to understand. As you read this story, hindsight might portray these avoidant, unresponsive passengers as foolish, irrational, and reckless. However, their response perfectly illustrates a very human, very common behavioral phenomena called the ostrich effect. The ostrich effect. When an ostrich senses danger, it buries its head in the sand. The idea is that if the ostrich can just hide from the threat, the danger will eventually pass. We humans are no different. When dealing with difficult information, situations, or conversations, we tend to be like the ostrich and bury our heads in the sand too. As humans, we are hardwired to avoid discomfort. We stop ourselves from checking our bank accounts when we know we've overspent, we avoid difficult conversations that we don't want to have, and more problematically, we delay booking that doctor's appointment, to avoid receiving bad news about our health. A report recently released by UK bank TSB revealed that indebted British people are cumulatively losing £55 million a month by not confronting their finances and making simple changes. One substantiating study found that investors were likely to check the value of their personal investment portfolios when the markets overall were rising, but would avoid looking when the markets were flat or falling. In a more startling study of 7,000 women aged 50 to 64, researchers found that women who had heard a colleague had been diagnosed with breast cancer were almost 10% or less likely to go and get a free checkup themselves. In the moment when the ostrich effect kicks in, we don't just have anxiety, the anxiety has us, and that anxiety presses us to avert our gaze from the thing that is making us most anxious. As psychiatrist George Valiant notes, denial can be healthy, enabling individuals to cope with rather than become immobilized by anxiety, or it can be unhelpful, creating a self-deception that alters reality in ways that are dangerous. In entrepreneurship, the ostrich effect is too often the difference between a company's success or failure. Research conducted by Leadership IQ, the corporate survey firm, collected data from more than 1,000 board members across almost 300 organizations that had fired their CEO. They found that 23% of those boards had fired their CEO for denying reality, 31% are for mismanaging change, 27% are for tolerating low-performing staff, and 22% are for inaction. These are all common corporate symptoms of the ostrich effect. In business, the person with the fewest blind spots stands the greatest chance of victory. We think better, make better decisions, and achieve better outcomes when we're closest to reality. The stories of Kodak, Nokia, Blockbuster, Yahoo, BlackBerry, and MySpace illustrate clearly that those who feel most invisible are often most susceptible to becoming an ostrich in the face of innovation, change and inconvenient truths. How to avoid becoming an ostrich. I interviewed world-renowned author Nir Eyal in my office in New York in preparation for this book. He's spent several years studying what motivates human behavior at the best and worst of times. He told me, people think they're motivated by seeking pleasure. They're wrong. They're motivated by avoiding discomfort. Even sex, and the horniness it creates, is a form of discomfort that we seek to relieve ourselves from. Most people don't want to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that distraction is always an unhealthy escape from reality. How we deal with uncomfortable internal triggers determines whether we pursue healthy acts of traction or self-defeating distractions. In my own career, none of my greatest professional mistakes and regrets were unsuccessful business decisions that I made. They were the instinctively obvious but terribly uncomfortable decisions I didn't make, the things I avoided confronting through fear, uncertainty, and anxiety. The person I knew I needed to fire but didn't, the conversation I needed to have with a client but avoided, and the warning I needed to articulate to the board that I delayed. Similarly, we can all relate to the toxic consequences that the ostrich effect can have on our romantic relationships, avoiding the difficult conversation, evading the awkward issues and pretending things are fine. These symptoms of co-denial and mutual avoidance hold a failing relationship in place, when neither party has the words, courage, or conviction to confront their unmet needs. Arguments happen, but they're rarely the right arguments. In a relationship, if you're having the same conversation over and over again, you are having the wrong conversation. You're avoiding the uncomfortable conversation you should be having. Pain in every walk of life is unavoidable, but the pain that we create by trying to avoid pain is avoidable. In business, the pain of the ostrich effect and the unresolved conflict it creates is felt by your employees. In parenting, it's felt by your children, and in your own life it will be felt in your mind, your body, and your soul. A White House staff member during the Kennedy administration once commented that it was always obvious when there was conflict between the president and the first lady versus when they were relating amicably. When met with surprise from the interviewer that their relationship would be so transparent, the staff member replied, "They actually were quite private about their struggles, but we knew when they were fighting simply by watching the interactions of their personal staffs. When the hairdressers and the transport people were arguing, we knew this was because JFK and Jackie were in some form of conflict. When these groups had their act together, we knew the first couple was getting on okay." At the core of this story from the Kennedy administration is the notion that conflict moves around within and between levels of a social system. When something is unresolved because we've chosen to bury our heads in the sand, it doesn't sit dormant, waiting to be addressed. It becomes toxic, contagious, and poisonous to those around us, and inflicts more collateral damage with every day that it remains unaddressed. 5 years ago, I realized that I needed to find a way to overcome my own ostrich-like behavior so that I could confront the most uncomfortable of realities in life, business, and love, with speed and honesty. It's my belief that you cannot reach your highest potential without a better relationship with discomfort, bad news, and inconvenient truths. Using advice from behavioral economics, psychology, and sociology, I created my own 4-step approach to dealing with discomfort and avoiding procrastination. Step 1. Pause and acknowledge. The first step is to pause and to admit to yourself that something is not right. Such moments of pause tend to come about when people notice the power and horrible longevity of their own unwanted emotions. If you don't pause, the process cannot begin and you cannot create enough space for the next step. Step 2. Review yourself. The next step is to inspect yourself in terms of feelings, behaviors, and emotions. These examinations are critical. They enable people to begin to articulate what they have only sensed, that something is awry in them, something is misaligned, a need is being unmet, or a fear has taken control. People who pause and inspect themselves are like detectives that are aware that a crime has been committed. They can see the evidence in its wake, but they haven't yet identified the culprit. Solving such crimes usually involves the help of others. People need help to get outside of their own narratives and accurately diagnose themselves, rather than simply being driven by their preferred ways to frame and blame. Step 3. Speak your truth. The next step is to speak your truth. Share the findings of your inspection, without blame, and with an emphasis on personal responsibility. This marks the moment that unaddressed interpersonal conflicts move from the wrong conversations to the right conversations. In the ostrich effect, people turn away from and do not speak directly of the emotions that grip them. They avert their gaze, misdiagnose the issues, and distract themselves with something else. The issue that lies beneath remains unspoken. That silence drives the ostrich effect. Loosening its grip begins with the moments that people speak what has not yet been spoken. Ironically, the science shows that it is in talking about our disconnect ions that people create more connectedness with one another. Step 4. Seek the truth. In the last step, you must humbly seek the truth, a feat that is easier said than done in the presence of our cognitive biases, righteousness and ignorance. This means to listen. But not just listening to hear, listening to understand. Not from the perspective of an adversary that's looking for victory, but from the perspective of a partner, patiently intent on overcoming a difficulty. When you do seek, hear, and understand the truth, the discomfort it creates may tempt you to bury your head once again, but the key is to return to the first step, take a pause, and repeat the process until you reach an end. The law: don't be an ostrich. Avoiding uncomfortable realities and difficult conversations is unhelpful, in business and in our personal relationships. We must recognize what isn't right, assess what we can do about it, share our findings and get to the truth, however challenging that might be. If you want long-term success in business, relationships, and life, you have to get better at accepting uncomfortable truths as fast as possible. When you refuse to accept an uncomfortable truth, you're choosing to accept an uncomfortable future. Law 24. You must make pressure your privilege. This law teaches you how comfort is slowly killing us mentally, physically, and emotionally. It will help you understand how and why we must make life's pressures our privilege. With 39 Grand Slam titles, Billie Jean King was expected to win. People were counting on her. The pressure might have been too much for anyone else, but not her. She had won a record 20 titles at Wimbledon. The entire tennis world watched her play. Every sports writer was ready to criticize her every move. When asked how she coped with the unthinkable burden of the world's expectations, Billie Jean King casually replied, "Pressure is a privilege, it only comes to those that earn it." This statement, "pressure is a privilege," naturally evokes a mixed reaction, as most overly simplified mantras do. When people hear it, they hear, "stress is a privilege," so it's important to clarify that stress and pressure are two entirely different things. Stress is an internal psychological response and pressure is an external environmental force. Of course, pressure can cause both good and bad stress, depending on the individual, but the pressure itself is not at fault. The pressure is a subjective situation, not an objective emotion, and in the presence of a strong pressure, one person's stress is another person's pleasure. I don't enjoy all my pressure, especially not in the moment, and none of my pressure is easy. It's often tested me in ways I wouldn't have volunteered to be tested, but all my greatest pressure has preceded all my greatest privileges. The two concepts have a clear, unbreakable relationship that I find liberating, motivating, and reassuring to understand. Pressure shines a light on who I am and who I'm not at the same time, simultaneously illuminating how far I've come and how far I'm yet to go. For me, a life without pressure is a life without purpose. The pressure isn't the problem, as I said, pressure is neither good nor bad, but our relationship, perspective, and evaluation of pressure and the stress it creates can have purposeful or deadly consequences. Just a cold, dark night on the side of Everest. Pressure isn't life or death, but your perspective of it might be. At the University of Wisconsin, researchers conducted a study of stress on 30,000 American adults. They asked the participants questions like, "How much stress have you experienced in the last year?" and, "Do you think that stress is harmful for your health?" 8 years later, they used public death records to find out who was still alive. Unsurprisingly, people who experienced a lot of stress during the time covered by the study had a 43% increased risk of dying. But, and this a big but, that was only true for the people who had said that they believed that stress was detrimental to their health. People who experienced a lot of stress but did not see it as harmful were no more likely to die. In fact, analysis showed that they had the lowest risk of dying of anyone in the study, even including people who had reported experiencing relatively little stress. The researchers estimated that over the 8 years they were tracking deaths, 182,000 Americans died prematurely, not from stress, but from the belief that stress is bad for you. Kelly McGonigal is a health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. In a TED Talk on this study, she pointed out, if the researchers' estimate was correct, believing stress is bad for you would be the 15th most common cause of death in the United States, killing more people than skin cancer, HIV/AIDS and homicide. Can you recall the last time you felt real pressure? Your heart may well have been pounding, you might have been breathing faster, You might have had clammy hands. Usually we interpret these physical symptoms as anxiety or signs that we aren't coping well with the pressure. But what if you saw them differently, as signs that your body is energizing you in preparation to face a challenge? That is exactly what researchers conducting a study at Harvard University told participants before putting them through a high-pressure test. Participants who learned to view the stress response as helpful for their performance were less anxious, felt more confident and performed better. Particularly interesting was the changes to their physiological stress response. Typically, your heart rate goes up and your blood vessels constrict in times of stress, which is an unhealthy state to remain in. But in the study, when participants saw their physiological symptoms as beneficial, it didn't stop their heart rate going up but their blood vessels stayed relaxed and open, meaning their cardiovascular response was considerably healthier. McGonigal remarked that participants who viewed stress as beneficial had a similar cardiovascular profile to people who were experiencing moments of joy and courage. Additionally, Harvard Business School professor Alison Wood Brooks has shown how people who mentally reframe anxiety as excitement can improve their performance in tasks such as sales, negotiating and public speaking. This one psychological mindset shift, and the physical transformation it creates, could be the difference between a stress-induced heart attack at age 60 and living until you're 90. The objective isn't to try and get rid of your pressure, it's to change your relationship with it altogether. One important way to improve your relationship with your pressure is to remind yourself of the positive privilege, meaning and context it exists in. The difference between aspirational pressures, building a business, competing in a tournament or raising a child, and the pressure faced by a low-paid production line worker on a factory floor, under threat of being fired if they don't improve their output, is how we relate to the pressure. Pressure we view as voluntary, meaningful, and high in autonomy is received as a privilege. Conversely, compulsory, meaningless, low autonomy pressure feels more like psychological pain. Just another cold, dark night on the side of Everest is a phrase I've naturally repeated for the last 5 years in my hardest moments to bring me back to the context of my stress. When mountaineers commit to taking on Mount Everest, they'd be naive to expect a smooth journey. The same, of course, is true of starting a company, pursuing a university degree or raising a child. All of these things induce pressure, stress, and pain, but because that pressure is subjectively worthwhile, it feels different and, dare I say, enjoyable. You are most susceptible to feel like a victim of the pressure in your life when you forget the context of that pressure. The most meaningful challenges in your life will come with a few dark nights on the side of Everest. Make your pressure your privilege. Thankfully, it is possible to change your relationship with pressure. After combining years of qualitative and empirical research in psychology, a study published in the Harvard Business Review, drawing on their work with executives, students, Navy SEALs and professional athletes found that people who adopt a stress-is-enhancing mindset enjoy a better performance at work and fewer negative health symptoms than those who see stress as a negative, debilitating thing. I believe changing how you respond to stress and pressure can help you harness the creative power of stress while minimizing its detrimental effects. I've done this by adopting the 3-step Harvard Business Review approach, and share it with you here, plus a final step of my own. Step 1, see it. Awareness is the first step in hijacking any type of cognitive cycle. Don't deny it, avoid it, or let it paralyze you, speak it, name it. This literally changes how your brain responds, because it activates the more conscious, deliberate areas of the brain rather than the primal, automatic, reactive centers. As HBR explains. In one study, participants in a brain scan were shown negative emotional images. When asked to label the emotion the images invoked, neural activity moved from the amygdala region, the seat of emotion, to the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain in which we do our conscious and deliberate thinking. In other words, purposefully acknowledging stress lets you pause your visceral reaction, allowing you to choose a more enhancing response. In addition to this, it seems that trying to deny or ignore feelings of stress is counterproductive. Harvard Business Review research by Peter Salovey and Sean Aker demonstrated that those of us who think of pressure as debilitating and strive to avoid it either overcorrect or underreact to stress, whereas those with a mindset that allows them to embrace the positives have a more moderate cortisol response to stress. What this means in practice is that they are more willing to seek out and be open to feedback during stress, which can help them learn and grow for the longer term. Step 2, share it. A study conducted at the University at Buffalo found that every major stressful life experience increased an adult's risk of death by 30% or unless they then spent a significant amount of time connecting with loved ones and their immediate community. Then, there was no increase to the risk of death. Sharing our stress with a supportive community completely changes the psychological impact that stress has on us. When we choose to connect with others under stress, an incredible resiliency is created. Step 3. Frame it. The key to owning your pressure is to recognize the positive role it plays and the powerful signal it represents. We feel pressure when something matters, when there is something at stake, when we care. Framing your pressure in this context unleashes positive motivation and calms your physiological reaction. It reminds you that this is just another cold night on the side of Everest, a mountain that you both choose to climb and a mountain that is worth the climb. In Navy SEAL training, former SEAL Commander Kurt Cronin says, "The leadership squad designs situations that are exponentially more stressful, chaotic, and dynamic than any combat operation so that the teams learn to center themselves in the most arduous circumstances. When the stress of the training seems unbearable, we can own it, knowing that ultimately it is what we have chosen to do, to be a member of a team that can succeed in any mission. And that's a worthwhile pressure to endure." Step 4. Use it. When under pressure, stress can help you to succeed. The evolutionary goal of stress is to push you to perform at your best. Both mentally and physically, to raise your game and meet the scenario or the problem you face. Our physical response to stress is to produce hormones, such as adrenaline and dopamine, which provide the brain and body with much needed blood and oxygen. This results in a state of higher energy, enhanced alertness, and a boost in focus. What a wonderful way for our body to prepare us. Don't fight it, use it. Former Navy SEAL Commander Cronin recently said, "Learning to ask, how could these experiences serve us, and being pushed to use them to fuel us, proved a powerful tool in helping our individuals, teams, and organization thrive, not in spite of the stress but because of it." As Teddy Roosevelt famously said, "If we are to fail, at least we fail while daring greatly, which is a more admirable fate than that of those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Pressure can save your life. In preparation for this book, I interviewed more than 10 health experts about the topic of stress, pressure, and its impact on our health. One of the most surprising recurring concerns I had presented to me can be summarized in something said to me by Gary Brecaw, founder of 10x Health. "We are living in a comfort crisis. We are slowly suffocating ourselves to death with comfort by avoiding the hard things that are good for our health. Aging is our aggressive pursuit of comfort." He believes that humans physiologically thrive and are innately designed to live under the right types of pressure. He says we're supposed to experience extreme cold and hot temperatures, we're not meant to live in perfectly regulated room temperature environments. And we're supposed to exert physical strain on our bodies, we're not meant to be this sedentary. Other health experts I spoke to told me that the cost of avoiding these types of physiological pressure are seen in the obesity crisis, the rise in heart disease and many types of preventable illnesses. Professional, psychological, and physiological pressure is so often a privilege that we choose to ignore because it's hard, and as stated previously we are discomfort-avoiding humans. However, in all aspects of life, hard is the price we pay today for an easy tomorrow. The law: you must make pressure your privilege. Pressure doesn't have to be a negative thing, and, if framed correctly, it can be energizing. Recognizing, owning, and using pressure can be a powerful tool when it comes to achieving our aims in business and life. Comfortable and easy are short-term friends but long-term enemies. If you're looking for growth, choose the challenge. Law 25. The power of negative manifestation. This law teaches us the wonderful power of something I call negative manifestation and how it can help you see red flags, future risk, and anything else that stands in the way of your success. There exists a single question that, in my experience, has spared me more financial loss, squandered time, and wasted resources than any other. This question, which I've grasped the significance of through a litany of failures, setbacks, and blunders, often goes unasked due to the unease it stirs within us. Avoiding this question places you in a perilous position, akin to the proverbial ostrich burying its head in the sand, as depicted in Law 23. Whether you ask this question or not, you will eventually find out the answer, either now, through an uncomfortable conversation, or in the future, in a much more painful way. I was 18 years old in 2013, when I learned the value of this question through a painful lesson. I had set out to build an online student platform called Wallpark, and after pouring 3 years of my time, investors' capital, and metaphorical blood, sweat and tears into the project, it ultimately culminated in failure. As the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20ths. Looking back, the reason for my failure seems obvious. I was unknowingly competing with Facebook in a contest I stood no chance of winning. But the thing is, this revelation needn't have required hindsight. I didn't need to experience failure to recognize it. If only I'd had the humility, experience, and strength to sincerely ask myself one straightforward question, I believe I could have circumvented the loss of time, money, and effort altogether. That pivotal question is, why will this idea fail? This question might appear straightforward and evident, yet when I surveyed more than 1,000 startup founders, startlingly only 6% claimed they were clear on why their idea could fail, while a tremendous 87% were clear on why it would succeed. The reality is that most startups eventually fail, and when they do, as mine did, the founders seem to suddenly see the obvious, with the majority of them attributing their downfall to overestimating their prospects and underestimating the risks. For instance, according to the Small Business Administration in the United States, 52% of failed founders acknowledged underestimating the resources needed for success, 42% admitted to not realizing the market didn't desire their product, and 19% confessed to underestimating their competition. I am convinced that the most crucial, revealing question these unsuccessful startup founders ought to have asked themselves and their colleagues before pursuing their ventures was, why will this idea fail? Both doctors and ailing patients can attest to the notion that prevention is better than cure, and in business there's no chance of prevention without having a humble confrontation with the prospect of failure before starting out. There are 5 main reasons why we shy away from engaging in this dialogue or even contemplating the possibility of failure. These 5 psychological biases, consistently identified across numerous studies, will likely prevent you and your team from asking this seemingly simple yet essential question. Optimism bias. Taylor Shero told me that about 80% of us have this bias. Simply put, it makes us focus on good things and ignore bad things. It stopped me from asking, why will Wallpark fail, because I innately believed and wanted things to end well. It's believed that this bias gave us an evolutionary advantage. Optimism helped us take more survival risks, explore new environments and find new resources, but in our professional lives it prevents us from adequately considering risk. Confirmation bias. We all have this bias to some degree. It causes us to pay attention to information that supports our existing ideas and hypotheses. It caused me to pay attention to, and accept, information that proved Wallpark was a good idea and ignore all of the data, emails, and feedback that suggested otherwise. Research shows that this human bias boosts our self-esteem and gives us emotional comfort by making our worldview feel consistent, coherent, and correct. Self-serving bias. This bias impacts most of us to varying degrees and it leads us to believe that our success or failure is a result of our own skill and effort. Its certainty stopped me from thinking about why Wallpark would fail, because it made me overestimate my own abilities while underestimating the impact of external factors, such as market conditions, competition, or other unforeseen circumstances. Sunk cost fallacy bias. This bias makes us stick with a decision, even when evidence suggests that it was a bad decision, because we've already spent time or money on it. It's the reason why Wallpark carried on for 3 years instead of 1. Subconsciously I didn't want to waste or lose the time and money that had been invested by quitting, but in doing so, I ended up wasting even more time and money. Groupthink bias. This bias prevents a group of people from asking, why will this idea fail, because they don't want to disagree with the group. At Wallpark, at no point did any of the founding team question if the idea would fail. We had all likely conformed around the same blind hypothesis because of our desire for social cohesion, which created a strong conformity pressure for any new team members. The question saved my business. In 2021, I had a bold idea. Riding the wave of success from my podcast, The Diary of a CEO, I envisioned launching an entire podcasting network. This ambitious plan involved creating a multitude of fresh podcasts, each featuring renowned and talented hosts. My goal was to harness our team's commercial, production and marketing expertise to propel these podcasts to the same heights as the Diary of a CEO. We had a wealth of experience in scaling a #1 podcast. I had a phone book brimming with well-known personalities eager to collaborate with me on their own podcasts. I had a team of 30 people that worked on the Diary of a CEO, and I had the financial resources to invest in this new venture. To bring my vision to life, I gathered a dedicated group of 5 people from the Diary of a CEO team, and over the course of a year, we meticulously planned the network, meeting with potential hosts and scouting for partners. I invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into the planning and preparation process, along with countless hours of my own time and energy, as well as that of my team members. 6 months into the project, I extended a formal offer to the head of one of the world's largest media companies to run the network as CEO. To my delight, he provisionally accepted and told me he would resign when I gave him the green light to join us. Finally, after 12 months of planning, the day of reckoning arrived. I was faced with the critical decision of whether to ask the incoming CEO of this new podcast network to leave his well-paying job and join our ranks. I knew this choice marked the point of no return. If I took this decision, there would be no looking back. It would be full steam ahead with launching a large-scale podcasting network. In that defining moment, the wisdom I had accumulated over a decade in business kicked in. I gathered my team and posed a simple yet profound question: why is this a bad idea? As I observed their uncomfortable expressions, it was evident that their minds were grappling with an entirely new challenge, one they had never contemplated before. Within moments, the floodgates opened. One team member pointed out that our limited talent pool would be spread too thin, jeopardizing our existing successful podcast business. Another chimed in, highlighting the potential unreliability of famous hosts and the risk of losing everything if a host decided to leave. Another pointed to serious concerns about the economy, and how this would cause dwindling sponsorship opportunities. Another explained that it would be more difficult than we thought to replicate our initial success because some of it was due to luck, circumstance and fortune. Once the cascade of logical reasons had subsided, a team member turned the question back on me: why do you think this is a bad idea? In this moment, I realized that my subconscious had been harboring a concern rooted in past experience, which I had been avoiding due to psychological bias. My response was simple and honest: focus. I explained that our collective focus was our most valuable resource. Failure tempts people to lose focus as motivation and belief decreases, but success tempts people to lose focus even more as opportunities, offers and capabilities increase. Maintaining focus on our existing project, which was still in a critical growth phase, was going to be both the most difficult and the most important thing for us to do. Our limited supply of focus, attention, and thinking power could not be stretched across multiple projects without serious consequences. Those shower thoughts, that 1 a.m. epiphany, that passing conversation in the hallway, we needed all those precious moments to be focused on our existing podcast business, on finding marginal ways to improve and on reaching our potential. I emphasized that by concentrating our efforts, we could achieve compounding returns far greater than those from any podcast network. Just minutes later, we unanimously voted to shut down the project. Remarkably, just an hour earlier, everyone in the room had been supportive of the idea and eager to launch the new venture. But one simple, uncomfortable question had shifted our collective mindset, invited important critical thinking and led us to see the project's flaws in high definition. A year later, with the benefit of hindsight, I can confidently say that pursuing the network would have been a costly mistake. Our team would have been stretched to its limits, our existing business would have suffered, and the economic downturn of 2022 would have severely impacted our financial performance. Our focus paid off, and in 2022 our existing podcast business grew by 900% in terms of audience size, and revenues climbed by more than 300%. In the world of business, teams like ours often devote months to meticulously outlining how and why their ideas will succeed. Yet they seldom allocate the same level of time to examining the potential reasons why their ideas might not work. This is where the power of a simple question, "Why is this a bad idea?" comes into play. By posing this question, we encourage an essential form of critical thinking that unveils risks and challenges often obscured by the aforementioned 5 innate human biases. Rather than merely seeking validation for our ideas, we challenge ourselves to confront their weaknesses head-on. Our intention is not simply to find reasons to abandon an idea, but rather to embrace the adage that prevention is better than cure. Identifying potential issues before embarking on a project enables us to address and circumvent them, paving the way for a smoother journey to success. The pre-mortem method, your secret weapon for avoiding failure. Regrettably, human nature often prevents us from thinking or acting preemptively to avoid worst-case scenarios. Many of us neglect to adopt healthy habits, such as proper exercise and nutrition, until our well-being is in jeopardy. We overlook the importance of keeping our car maintained until we face a breakdown, and we won't replace a damaged roof until water droplets pitter-patter on our heads. The post-mortem examination, or autopsy, is a procedure undertaken by medical professionals to determine the cause of death by examining a body. A pre-mortem is the hypothetical opposite of a post-mortem. You do it before the death has occurred. The pre-mortem method is a decision-making technique developed by scientist Gary Klein, which encourages a group to think from a place of failure, before a project has begun. Instead of simply asking, what could go wrong, the pre-mortem relies on you imagining that the patient has died and asks you to explain what did go wrong. Now, imagine if we could harness this concept and apply it to our daily lives and professional endeavors. Scientific research shows that this simple thought experiment, performing a metaphorical autopsy before a calamity occurs, can drastically reduce the chance of failure altogether. In a groundbreaking 1989 study, researchers delved into the fascinating world of the pre-mortem method and its impact on predicting outcomes. Participants were split into two groups. One group harnessed the power of the pre-mortem method to envision various business, social and personal events as if they had already unfolded, and dissect the possible reasons that they hadn't succeeded. In contrast, the other group merely made predictions without any direction at all. The group employing the pre-mortem method exhibited significantly higher accuracy in predicting how the given scenarios would play out and determining the causes of those outcomes. These findings show that by contemplating failure in advance, we can better comprehend its potential origins and take proactive measures to avoid it. An additional study conducted in 1989 by researchers at two universities found the same stark results. This simple method of imagining that a failure has already occurred increased the ability to correctly identify the reasons for the future outcome by 30%. Since 2021, I've implemented the pre-mortem analysis across all my companies to great success. Here is the 5-step process I use to deploy the pre-mortem method. Set the stage, gather relevant team members and clearly explain the purpose of the pre-mortem analysis, to identify potential risks and weaknesses, not to criticize the project or individuals. Fast forward to failure, ask your team to imagine that the project has failed and encourage them to visualize the scenario in vivid detail. Brainstorm reasons for failure. Instruct each team member to independently generate a list of reasons that could have led to the project's failure, considering both internal and external factors. It's important that this is done independently and on paper to avoid groupthink. Share and discuss. Have each team member share their reasons for failure, fostering an open and non-judgmental discussion to uncover potential risks and challenges. Develop contingency plans, based on the identified risks and challenges. Work together to create contingency plans and strategies to either mitigate or avoid these potential pitfalls altogether. This isn't just business advice, it's life advice. The truth is, humans make really shitty decisions clouded in emotion, induced by fear and influenced by insecurity. We're not very logical, we're riddled with biases, and in our decision-making, we're always searching for shortcuts. The power of the pre-mortem method extends far beyond the realm of business. It's been a potent tool for making better decisions in various aspects of my personal life. Having robust decision-making frameworks has allowed me to make more effective and less regrettable decisions in the most important areas of my life at the most important moments in my life. Here's how you can apply it in different scenarios. Choosing a career path. When deciding on a career, conduct a pre-mortem analysis by envisioning yourself years into the future, having experienced significant dissatisfaction or failure in that career. Work backwards to identify potential reasons for this dissatisfaction, such as lack of interest in the job, limited growth opportunities or work-life imbalance. By considering these factors, you can refine your career choice or devise strategies to mitigate potential issues. Choosing a partner. When contemplating a long-term relationship or marriage, Imagine a scenario in which the relationship has failed or become unfulfilling. Identify factors that may have contributed to the decline, such as misaligned values, poor communication, intimacy problems, or differing expectations. By addressing these concerns proactively and proactively searching for red flags, you can make a more informed decision about the partnership or work on strengthening the relationship from the outset. Making a considerable investment. When contemplating a significant investment, such as purchasing a home or investing in the stock market, envision a scenario in which the investment leads to financial loss. Identify potential causes for this outcome, such as market fluctuations, inadequate research, or overestimating your financial capacity ahead of time. By understanding these risks, you can make more informed decisions, perform thorough due diligence, and take steps to minimize potential losses. In the present age, it appears that every social media quote I encounter demands that I visualize success, extolling the virtues of manifestation and positive thinking. While optimism undoubtedly holds immense value and positive thinking has genuine merit, there lies an equally profound potency in embracing negative contemplation, visualizing failure and planning accordingly. The power of negative manifestation. Our cognitive wiring instinctively steers us away from thoughts that induce psychological unease. However, much like the proverbial ostrich with its head buried in the sand, this avoidance often leads us towards even greater psychological distress. Paradoxically, in all facets of life, engaging in an uncomfortable conversation today paves the way for a more comfortable life in the future. Prevention is easier than cure. Embracing this duality of thought, balancing positivity with negativity, equips us with the wisdom, fortitude, and foresight to forge a more successful path forward. You can predict someone's success in any area of their life by observing how willing and capable they are at dealing with uncomfortable conversations. Your personal progression is trapped behind an uncomfortable conversation.